Hello and welcome to the Farm.One podcast, coming to you from our vertical farm here in Manhattan. My name's Rob Lang. I'm the CEO and founder of Farm.One. And today I'm joined by Benjamin Lorr, and he's the author of The Secret Life of Groceries, which is a book in which he pulls the curtain back and shows us the complex and sometimes troubling world behind how our food gets to the grocery store. And so, welcome, Ben. Really excited to have you here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me in this little urban paradise. This is like the top secret life of groceries, I feel like. Like 2 levels below the Manhattan streetscape, there lurks a farm.
Yeah, very good. And so I'm excited to have you here. And I'm sort of curious, initially, what was the thing that inspired you to write this book in the first place?
So it's actually a very clear origin moment. I had been writing this book on Bikram yoga, which very interesting part of I'm an immersive journalist to some extent, so I was doing a lot of yoga during the writing of that book, and was marooned at a hotel in San Diego for a teacher training to get close to Bikram Choudhury, who's this kind of megalomaniacal guru at the heart of that book. And I was really interested in why yoga was exploding and why people were doing why yoga became this mass trend, where there was 19 Bikram studios in New York. And then one day they let us out of this hotel where we were kind of stuck doing yoga for 9 weeks, twice a day. And we went to a Trader Joe's, and all the yogis descended from this van that the teacher training had hired to cart us to and from. And they just went bananas. It was like kids at an amusement park going into a grocery store. And there just was this light bulb moment where I was like, oh, these are similar phenomenon. The idea that grown adults are getting this excited about a grocery store just dovetailed with some other observations about how food had changed in the American landscape over the last 30 to 40 years, from a place where when I was growing up, the grocery store was definitionally a chore. It was boring, bland, and you didn't want to do it. And now people were identifying with it as this value signifier.
It's really interesting. And I think I'm someone as a consumer where I go into the grocery store and I see it as this kind of convenient place where all this stuff is that I want. But what am I kind of missing? What's behind that?
Well, you're not missing one thing, which is it's designed to produce that abundance. And the big message from its inception that the supermarket has kind of been pounding is abundance, 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 and choice, choice, choice. And we're going to overwhelm you with these 2 things and use them strategically to lower prices in a volume game. And that's going to cause this feedback cycle where you purchase more and more and more. So I think that message is hitting home. There are a lot of hidden facets to how those 2 values of abundance and choice are delivered and convenience is delivered that get a little less savory. And that's where the book, kind of looks at all the hidden voices that are delivering that convenience to us and the ways that there's a cost to our kind of consumer pressures that gets borne on them.
Yeah. And so give us maybe a little bit of history. How did we get to here? Because it hasn't always been like this, right?
Sure. So if you travel back in time, you get to something called the general store, which was, you can picture the guy behind the counter who is behind a counter. You weren't allowed to touch the goods at the general store. It was about the size of a convenience store, maybe a little smaller. It sold boots. It sold medicines. It had, opiums. It had food, but they were dried fruit in barrels that the clerk would have to chisel out. It had some dry goods, seasonal produce. Meat and other fresh goods were sold elsewhere. And that general store kind of ambled along until there was a revolution in packaging. And I always say, forget the wheel. The big development of the 20th century retail, at least, is the cardboard box, which really transformed shipping and made it, directly connected the supplier to the grocery store and made regular shipments possible. And alongside that revolution in packaging, there was this insight that if we, once goods are in packages, they need a brand identity. You can't just put a cardboard box without a logo on it. And once there's a brand identity, people are going to want to choose between different things. And that really flipped the store because you no longer really wanted or trusted the clerk on the other side to deliver things to you. That he became this object of suspicion. Instead, you wanted to be the one touching things. And so that was kind of the first step into a self-service grocery store. The Piggly Wiggly was the first in Memphis, Tennessee. And then that just got blown up into the supermarket where people discovered, okay, we can cut staffing by letting people touch the goods themselves. We don't need trained employees. And if we just have a bigger footprint and we locate it off the downtown strip, we can save money on real estate. And doing so cut prices tremendously, which creates that feedback cycle I was talking about earlier where people decide, well, this is cheap and there's a lot of it, so I'm just going to put more in my cart than I expected. And it becomes a margin game.
Yeah, yeah. And so what decade are we kind of talking about most of this innovation happening?
All right, so general store, we're talking like 1830s to 1890s. Clarence Saunders and the Piggly Wigglies, like 1916. And you know, he really thought about this like this was reinventing, this was the assembly line. And he was right dovetailed with Henry Ford. You know, people are going to walk through the grocery store the way we walk through an IKEA today on like a very set path, and you pick your things off the shelves just like you're wandering down an assembly line. And then 1930 was Michael Cullen invented the first, you know, generally recognized as the first supermarket, which was King Cullen right here in New York.
Yeah, okay. And what might that range of produce look like at that point when the supermarket started to happen versus today?
Range of produce. I mean, well, first of all, just shipping. I mean, like advances in preservation weren't there. So I think leafy greens had to make it to the store in like 3 to 5 days. You know, like otherwise they were toast. And so that limited what was available. There's no cross-country shipments of leafy greens. And there, you know, your options for salad greens, I mean, honestly, I can't even imagine. They were probably mostly grown at home at that time, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and then talking about other produce, what would you expect to find on the grocery store shelves of like the 1930s that you might not see today?
That's a good question. I mean, you know, there's a lot of food fads. I mean, in terms of, I mean, they cared about different things. You know, I know, for instance, like the age of a chicken, you know, produces different. And I'll just blank on the names of the different stages, but there's like young chicken, middle-aged chicken, old chicken that people used to be very attuned to. So when you would go buy your meat, you would choose the type of chicken that you would want. Obviously, that just, you know, we don't differentiate between that anymore. We all have broiler chickens that are like 48 days old and swollen on corn.
That's crazy, huh?
Yeah.
But the things that you're sort of describing, like the movement from the general store to grocery store to supermarket, like it sounds like for the consumer, it sounds great, right?
Yeah.
Is that true? Did everyone see it as this kind of positive development?
I think so. I mean, when the first American-style supermarket opened overseas, this is 1956 in Rome. Like people genuinely lost their minds. Like it was like to the Italian women, like there's stories of them like running up and down the aisle, like giddy and like shrieking with delight. And I don't think those are like press reports that were like designed to, like I think people had never seen something that offered that much abundance. And if you think about it, that it is something we, up until COVID, that we pretty much took for granted. We have more options, you know, at New York, just walking down the street than like kings and pharaohs had in their like height of their dominion. And we just kind of shrugged. But when that was first presented, I think it was pretty much universally seen as this amazing, a human accomplishment.
Yeah, yeah. And so your book sort of uncovers some of the hidden side of that. Like, what are the consequences of being able to present this abundance?
Yeah. And so that abundance and the convenience by which it's delivered does come largely with like just nested races to the bottom. The price comparison shopping that the consumer is doing, or the picky ingredient list that you're doing as a consumer, is echoed throughout the chain, from the buyers to the brokers, to the aggregators, to the manufacturers, to the producers who are producing it. And there's an intense downward pressure in that price comparison and hunt for lowest price that really gets taken out on labor. Labor is the place, it's the one place in a world of globalized standards where you have XYZ ethical audit and safety audit and all these standards that you have to hit to enter the global marketplace. Labor is this one place where if you're a producer, you're semi in control. And so that's where costs get delivered. And of course that creates, quickly undignified working conditions, which we see and accept in the States, but in more marginalized places, it becomes like inhumane working conditions. So for the book, I looked at wage labor in New York and the ways that minimum wage jobs have shifted over time into things that are much more demeaning, and then looked at like the real bottom of the commodity chain in Thailand, where really unimaginable things like human bondage and modern slavery were embedded in the supply chain in ways that produce those low prices we have come to expect.
Yeah, and then, so again, like looking historically, is that something that has sort of always been the case, or is it something that, we've created through the grocery store system?
Look, that's a really deeper question, and probably one that I'm prepared to answer because I think it's something that I don't know the answer to. Agriculture has especially westernized agriculture has a really troubling relationship with labor abuse, slavery. It is not an accident, cotton in America, sugarcane in the Caribbean, bananas and Hawaii, like colonialism and food go hand in hand. And so to the extent that we have been unable to escape that historical condition, I think we're better at averting our eyes from it now, and we're better at pretending that we're not affected from it. And certainly there are vast differences between slavery in America, which was state mandated, like the nation state, and it was, passed from generational. So it's I'm not saying they're analogous, but agriculture has had pretty seedy ties to labor abuse from day one.
And so let's talk specifically. You mentioned in Thailand, for instance, slave labor being used to produce goods. What kind of goods are we talking about specifically that people might have seen on the shelves or purchased?
Yeah, well, so in the book, I do a very deep dive into shrimp and shrimp aquaculture and the farmed seafood industry. I think it's unfair to single those out because I don't think there's anything particularly evil about shrimp. And in fact, it's one of the things that worries me is that I'm going to paint, and I do think I paint a pretty devastating picture of that world in the book. And then people are going to be like, oh, I'm going to go to my grocery store and I'm not going to buy Thai shrimp. And therefore, I'm not part of this problem. And the truth is that one of the reasons we know so much about Thai shrimp is we've paid attention to it. And if you look at the bottom of many other commodity chains, from cattle to timber to cotton to chocolate to coffee, gold, like tons of commodities, the same abuses are endemic there.
Right. I've heard, for instance, that it's almost impossible to buy cacao that doesn't come from something that involves either child labor or slavery or something like that.
Absolutely. And the cacao supply chains are very similar to the Thai seafood chains in the sense that they involve aggregators who make it really difficult to have visibility through. So in Thailand, the fish will come off the boat and then someone will buy up from all the different smallholder boats and lump them all together. And then they will pass that on to another broker. And that broker may pass it even on to a third broker before it gets bought and enters kind of the global marketplace, at which point it's kind of been laundered. You can't figure out where that seafood is coming from, and establishing a chain of command, although companies will talk about it, is very difficult for people who study the supply chain. And that's the same thing, is my understanding, for West African chocolate.
Yeah. And so I guess in one way, the story of the grocery store is in a way a story of aggregation, right? And sort of systematization of all these different products, right?
Yeah, that's what the commodity game is. When you're creating a commodity, what you're doing is you're erasing salient differences so that you can exchange them fungible, so they become fungible goods, and that's amazing. And there are so many benefits to that, and I don't want to shortchange the benefits of that. You get regular manufacturing, you get consistency, you get advanced purchasing of product. Like modern society doesn't exist without erasing those differences. On the other hand, there are really horrendously bad things that come from that lack of nuance and that lack of visibility. Yeah. And that's what the book is, kind of like trying to hold up both of those things so people at least see what's being done on their behalf.
Yeah, and you also talk about how the produce actually ends up at the grocery store, like shipments, trucking, all that kind of thing. Tell us a little bit more about what we might not know about how our products get to our grocery store shelves.
Yeah, I mean, trucking is another example of like kind of these nested races to the bottom. A lot of people think, and I thought before writing the book, trucking, middle-class profession, Jimmy Hoffa, Teamsters, like highly unionized. It turns out that's dated from the 70s and maybe early 80s. But trucking has like been deregulated to an extreme point at this time. And the trucker and just about all aspects of it are kind of commodity pieces within that game. And there's intense price competition there. And the result is quite sad. The individual trucker is kind of viewed as a replaceable part. There's all sorts of schemes for recruiting it. The average turnover in trucking, for instance, in job turnover at major carriers has been something like 96 to 110% over the last decade, which means that like every person in that trucking fleet is getting hired and quitting or getting fired over the course of that year because it's a terrible job, it's a non-sustainable job, and that turnover creates a room for a lot of abuse because they recruit new trainees that to become a trucker, you have to take on a lot of debt. You have to get your trucking license. You have to go to CDL school. You have to get a truck that you can drive, these big fixed costs. And often the trucker will go into a lot of debt to get those. And that debt can then be used as kind of, classic debt peonage as a threat to push them and force them to work when they might not want to, or take loads that they might not want to take.
It sounds similar to chicken farming in the US as well.
These are all nested loops. I mean, the same economic forces are driving them. What I think is interesting is how much they're mirrored as us as consumers often. That's deregulation for you.
And so you have a particular way of doing your reporting. You're pretty embedded. I know you spent some time like with truckers and how, like, why do you take that approach and what does it lead you to discover that other people might not?
I take that approach because I don't really know any other way of doing things. I'm pretty good at book research. I like holding up in the library, but I feel like a phony if I was writing about truckers and all I had done is read people's PhD theses and picked up the phone and talked to a few truckers. I mean, especially for truckers, they're hard to get a handle on. There's so much of their experience is beneath the radar. I wouldn't have had a clue as to what was going on if I didn't spend time in the passenger seat, which was not fun time. It might sound like it was fun to go on the road with a trucker, but it's a pretty grueling lifestyle. And it gave me that sense. It's just about building empathy and connection with people, I think, is just getting as close as you can to their lived experience. Also, from a writing perspective, just selfishly, I would feel like a phony if I wrote in the detail that I write about and didn't have those first person experiences. And so I just want to write in an immediate fashion. And otherwise I can't do that unless I'm actually there.
No, I think it's great. And I'm curious about any specific stories or memories you have of moments with those truckers on the road.
I mean, there's all driving around with a trucker who's like taking a shit in a bag full of kitty litter 10 feet away from you because, she has irritable bowel syndrome, which is probably stress related, which is probably related to her job insecurity, which is probably related to, like all these other things that we're talking about. Like that sticks with you for sure. And I'm laughing about it, but obviously it's like one of those things where you laugh because, I mean, she was laughing too because it's the only thing you can do to not, get distraught.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's something that Of course, as consumers, we forget, or we see on a commercial a truck driving past some beautiful highway in, California or something, and so that we have this idealized view of trucking.
Yeah.
What are some other things that people don't know about truckers and the things they have to go through?
About truckers, or I mean, I think there's just. I would say people don't have a clue about any aspect of the logistical systems that kind of underpin the grocery world. So, just from the way, for instance, when you're trucking, someone has to unload the stuff from the back of the truck into the warehouse. It's actually a pretty dangerous job, and it's physical labor. There's the rolling kind of carts, and it's because there's high injuries in that. Nobody wants to own that job. It's called lumping, and there are lumpers, and they're almost all. I don't know. I can't even quantify it because nobody's really looking at it. I was going to say almost all are undocumented. I don't know if almost all of them are undocumented. I know that they're almost all marginalized people, and that nobody's really looking at them, and they're not employed by the warehouse. They're not employed by the trucking. They're kind of day laborers who show up to do this work because the trucker can get extra money if they are willing to lump their own goods. And that just means pull them out of the back of the truck into the warehouse. But the truckers don't do it. They don't want to take that $200 because they know they'll get injured doing it, and they won't be able to continue driving. And considering the economic health of the trucker, that's a pretty big thing to turn down, an extra $200 when you're making $17,000 a year. Just the details like that, I think we just don't have any clue as to the ways risks are outsourced in that industry and many other industries, and the kind of the workarounds that create convenience on our behalf.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Personally, I didn't know about that at all. And yeah, it really paints a picture of this sort of things falling between the gaps, right? And I guess I'm thinking about, there's been somewhat of a death of the union movement in the US, and I think we've recently seen Amazon against the unions, and unions didn't win that one. Has that sort of gone in parallel with the growth of the grocery store and logistics and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's a direct parallel. I think there has been larger than the grocery store. And for me, the grocery store is just a microcosm for all these things. I have to say, I think the grocery store did have a fundamental role in driving, changing kind of cost of living in this country and opening up space for a middle class by changing how we spend our food budgets. People used to spend 40% of their budget on food. Now we spend less than 10%. That positive benefit I do put on the grocery store. A lot of these negative things, I don't think grocery is driving these. These are larger forces that show up in the grocery industry. However, to answer your question, look, there's been 40 years of a policy where we're deregulating on behalf of a consumer. We're trying to drive low prices for consumer goods. That's perceived as good. And you can have a great, honest debate over whether that's good or bad, but people have just kind of decided, well, to make America good, or to make our economic system good, we're going to give people cheap prices, and that's going to enhance their quality of life. That policy comes at the expense of laborers. And problem is people are both consumers and laborers at the same time. And so I think that there's I think bringing that more 360 perspective is kind of what I'm after.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that perspective is the other externalities as well, right? Caused by that shipping, for instance. So trucking and the emissions associated with it. What did your research sort of show you about those externalities, the emissions and other things that are coming from our supply chains?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't spend that much time looking at trucking emissions, or I think that case has been made pretty convincingly by others. And so I can't give you chapter and verse on it, except for there's, something like 250 pounds of product is getting moved on your behalf today in this country, and every other man, woman, and child that's a lot of things being moved around on your behalf to maintain your lifestyle. And that takes, no matter how virtuous you are in remembering to unplug your socket, your device from the socket, and how much you're minimizing, there are these structural things that are producing a large amount of waste on our behalf.
Yeah. And then switching a little bit to the process and the choices that are available in a supermarket. You tell a story about an entrepreneur who has like a slaw, coleslaw type slaw,
Sure.
and wants to get that into people's hands and the difficulties they have. Can you talk about that and how that represents how difficult it is to enter that market?
It's amazing, and I'm curious to hear your journey to shelf. But so yeah, in the book, I found this amazing woman, Julie Boucher, who was marketing a product called Slausa, which was like a coleslaw salsa combination. It was very small. She had kind of found it when it was being manufactured in a commercial kitchen, and kind of made it her baby. To bring it to shelf, this is not someone who's connected to like big manufacturing plants, but she had an idea that she wanted to bring to market, and it's an amazingly arduous journey that I think I think I make a good guacamole, I could put it in a bottle and sell it, and it's like, no, you can't. There's all these factors that people in the industry are considering that have nothing to do with whether your guacamole or your salsa tastes good. Like, they care about shelf life, they care about the stability of the underlying commodities, they care about how your cost of goods can scale up, and they care whether or not you can pay them a fee to get onto the shelf, especially for dry goods or preserved goods like salsa. A lot of them are defined by what's known as slotting fees or trade spend, which means the supermarket is acting much more like a landlord leasing space than they are like some public market where the best quality things are going in. A significant part of the supermarket's bottom line comes from these fees. And so if you're a producer, you got to pay them. And if you can't pay them, you don't get in. It's a pay for play system. And it means if you're small, it's really tough to get access.
Yeah, I think as consumers, I guess one of the other ways we experience that is, you go into a supermarket and you're going to see a lot of products from big brands like Unilever and Procter and Gamble who are willing to pay those fees, or they already have the presence.
Right.
Whereas something from a smaller manufacturer might be tough, right?
Yeah, totally. And that's the legal, like, some people hear that and they're like, that's so corrupt. And it's like, that's completely legal. It's fine. It's just they're reinventing their business model to be something closer to landlords. Not so different than like the kind of things that are happening with the Apple app market. Like, we don't like to think of our marketplaces operating like that, but that's fine. But then there's also illegal corruption where supermarket buyers and producers are, especially from the big guys, are just exchanging outright bribes. And you can understand why that would make sense too. And I don't really cover that in the book so much because it's pretty hard to pin down. But everyone who I talk to is like, oh yeah, that's definitely happening. It makes complete sense why it would happen.
I mean, the same thing happens in the New York restaurant industry, where you have buyers for big restaurants who, of course, they get their Super Bowl tickets, they get their Knicks tickets,
And Super Bowl tickets is just scratching the surface when you're talking about, tens of $1 million accounts. That's cheap. You can get someone to buy someone a Super Bowl ticket that, like, they know their worth. They're probably not going to settle for that.
And so as a consumer, I think sometimes we try to look to labels, right? We maybe look for organic, we look for fair trade. Is that a great way to navigate the grocery store, or are there problems with that approach?
Yeah, there are problems with that approach. And it is a tough thing to talk about because I don't want to come down on a place of complete helplessness on a consumer. And you dig deep enough anywhere, you'll find things that are problematic. Labeling is certainly created with the best intentions, and I do want to honor those intentions. It's just they're really easily co-opted by the marketplace, who will sell you the feeling of being virtuous without actually delivering much in terms of structural change. And so that's kind of the story with a lot of those labels. Most labels, not all, and organic is a big exception here, are part of like a for-profit $50 billion per year industry that you can essentially shop around as either a supermarket or as a manufacturer to find the certification regime that you want for your product. And there's all sorts of misplaced incentives within that system, coming down to the fact that it's all based on audits, which make limited amount of sense, although we saw how they failed in the financial community in 2008. But they make a limited amount of sense in financial, where you're going over someone's static books and seeing if payments add up. They don't make much sense for visiting a farm, especially maybe a farm this size, but like some of these bigger farms with thousands of employees, or manufacturing plants with 50,000 employees, going in on a one-day audit, it produces a single snapshot. It's not an effective way of knowing whether or not someone's withheld wages 6 months ago. It's a misplaced tool, and so that's the backbone of this system, and so that itself is not so good. And then there's those incentives I was talking about, where it's a for-profit industry where the producers are paying for the auditors to come in. It doesn't add up to a place that I have tremendous amount of security in just the label.
Yeah. It reminds me of two things. First of all, I think I remember reading about this in Food Inc., which was, of course, like one of the first books to talk about the whole system. And they were talking about plants having advance warning of when an inspection was going to happen, of course.
Absolutely.
And then more recently with the film Seaspiracy, which of course, has its own problems, whatever, but they're talking about certified dolphin-free tuna, of course. And then when it comes down to it, they can't certify that it's dolphin-free at all.
I haven't seen Seaspiracy, so everyone's like, oh, you got to watch it. It's like a movie on your Thailand chapter. And then other people are like, oh, no, it's garbage. Don't watch it.
It's somewhere in between.
Okay. But I think regardless of the overall product, they don't, in seafood, they certainly don't have visibility down to the producer level. But even in places where there is visibility, the audit structure isn't designed to catch non-empirical, not something like a pathogen or food safety violation. Maybe it could work. But for something non-empirical like wage abuse, it's really not good at doing it. And you're going to have really or like environmental degradation. You're going to have trouble using that system to enforce those standards.
Yeah. Is this then a failure of government?
If you think your government guarantees you right to manufacturing claims, yes. I think the whole frame is a little backwards, I guess. I've come away from this book thinking that like empowering the consumer as the vehicle to get us a better food system is very seductive in a capitalist system and never going to quite work. It's too much burden on the consumer. It's too easily co-opted by marketers. And so the failure from government is that, look, things like wage abuse, things like forced labor, forget about, these are crimes. There should be legal enforcement on these things that don't rely on an auditor coming into with a clipboard to notice. Like if somebody's being chained up in a locked facility and forced to work, that is a criminal action that nation state level police solving. And we need trade treaties that honor that, right? We don't need fancy certification regimes or stickers on our food. That strikes me as a crazy way to solve that problem. If we're going to globalize work, which I think is, I'm in favor of globalizing work. I mean, international solidarity, but then we need international solidarity in the conditions that we're offering people and that we expect of people. We can't say, oh, we're going to spread this job and we're going to keep the standards, over here. That makes no sense.
Yeah. And then looking internationally, I know your book is mainly focused on the US, but are there things that we do particularly badly here that other countries have kind of figured out how to do better?
That's a great question. The answer is almost certainly yes. I don't know if I have a quick answer to that, though. Let me think about it. Things that we do better, or things that we do worse than other countries have figured out.
I mean, one of the examples I always think of is Japan. I used to live in Japan, and Japan does plenty of terrible things, but logistics in Japan often operates a lot better. You know, using rail networks, for instance, much more efficient, much lower emissions, and then not putting the burden on individual drivers so much to, you know, take this stuff around. So that's something that really kind of jumped out to me.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense, and I do think that, like, minimum wage. Yes, I mean, I blanked on this before, but yeah, it's obvious that there are many industrialized nations that treat their workers better than the U.S. does. And I think that that's something that can pretty much only happen systemically. Like, it really does help to have the government step in there, and we don't do that. You know, we saw $15 minimum wage in 2024 or whenever it was going to be enacted. Like, that got dropped from the stimulus, and whether that'll be picked up, I don't know, but it's something that's like on people's radar, kind of. But other countries are realized that no, we can pay our McDonald's workers a decent wage, give them vacation, and still have a functioning, healthy society. If one where people have dignity, that seems like something the U.S. is dropping the ball on.
Absolutely. And then bringing things down to maybe a little bit more of a controllable level, are there things that a city like New York can think about to improve some of these issues? You know, on a very small level, of course, we hope that urban agriculture, you know, can grow so that more of the food that we consume in the city is grown here. But are there other things that maybe we can do as a city better?
Yes, I'm sure. I mean, there's, you know, New York in particular being, you know, just from the services that we offer to the undocumented, who are really the backbone of a lot of aspects of the food system, I think there is things are on a smaller scale, and like connecting to individual producers, I do think is like a bona fide solution and like escape hatch from the certification regimes that I was just kind of talking about as in a damning way. Like, if you create an individual channel of trust one-to-one with someone you're working with, that is going to forever beat any seal and certification, and that is available on the small level of restaurateurs and you know, on a city level.
Yeah. And you mentioned before, and I think it's a really interesting sort of trend. Like, I feel like as a consumer, I'm kind of burdened with a lot of ethical decisions, a lot of environmental decisions, and do you think like that trend is just carrying on and getting more and more and more?
Well, it's a very addictive. Yeah, I think yes. I think one, it gives the consumer control or feeling of control. At the same time as it takes that control away from them. It's a little like airport security, which we can all like ridicule a little bit in the back of our minds. Like, oh, it's going up to an orange threat level. Oh, no, it's a code red. Like, these things that like both are scary when they happen, but at the same time, you're like, yeah, that's not really doing something. Somebody just smuggled in like 10 battle axes and like, you know, like a case of TNT. I think that there is an analogy to our relationship with certifications in that both we're addicted to them. If they don't exist, we're like, what's going on here? This is probably a really shady product. Why didn't they pony up for that certification? But the more that you become used to them, the more everything is suspect, right? Which is just the flip side of what I was just saying. But you can't wrap your head around something that doesn't have these stickers on them because you've been taught that it's to not trust something. And you just build layers and layers of like, oh, now I can't, I'm here making this case that you can't trust the certification. So people are going to be like, oh, well, we want people to certify the certifiers and make sure that they're good. And that already exists, people. And then people are going to be like, oh, well, we need to certify those certifiers. And, you know, it just becomes this pyramid scheme, you know, of people watching people, which just erodes trust fundamentally.
Yeah. I mean, the way I think about it, we think about it all the time is, you know, the USDA or the organic body goes back and forth on whether you should certify hydroponic farming as organic. And I could see both sides of that. But also, you know, in the controlled environment agriculture industry, there's folks who want to talk about the fact that, you know, we don't use any pesticides at all as opposed to organic pesticides. And also, you're probably more confident that someone's being treated better if they're working in New York City. And so within that community, now there's a movement to create a new label, which is a controlled environment agriculture label, right? Which is sort of, I mean, I can see why we want to do it, but also it creates some of the same issues, you know?
Yeah, it's a trade-off that I'd be curious how you guys navigate it. I mean, I think for me, again, it's like strengthening that individual brand that you have where people can be like, okay, Farm.One, I'm picking this up. I know where they are. I know what they do. I know what they stand by. And yeah, you can be gamed in that situation. It could turn out that this is just a Potomac village. But one, there's less waste in that system. So you get gamed as a consumer every once in a while. But you're not being gamed on the $50 billion per year systematic level of the audit system. And two, I just generally think that when you're creating individual relationships, you are less likely. I mean, there are sociopaths out there, but you are less. They're not that many of them. I hope.
And so, going back to the system as a whole, what do you think some really good things are that we've got going on that we got to make sure to keep?
Am I the person to ask about this? I don't know. Good things that we have to keep. I mean, I think we live in an age of miracles in the sense that I think we live in year-round strawberries, year-round basil, like the convenience that is offered by the grocery store is genuinely changing people's lives, allowing them to spend more of their income on other areas of their lives and hopefully live richer lives because of that. Although in the book, I kind of question to the extent that that's happening. But I think that those are real beautiful things that the system offers us. And they're magical. They're like our level quality of life in a food right now. Like for personal example, for Christmas, I decided on a whim that I was going to make a Gordon Ramsay goose. I had never cooked goose before in my life, and his recipe involved like Chinese 5-spice and a bunch of like spices I'd never even heard of when I consider myself pretty savvy. And within like an hour of reading that online, I'd gone to my local Whole Foods and gone to like one other store in the area, gotten a sustainable goose, with quotes around that, we don't know, and cooked it up and made this it was like a dream world. And that's the world we live in. I don't want to take that for granted.
Yeah. And so that's a nice segue. I was literally going to ask you, how did you shop before you wrote this book and how do you shop now?
Yeah, so the official answer is I really haven't changed anything. And that's because I do think arguments for like one of the big takeaways I had in this book is like, look, consumers and consumer discrimination is not going to drive change in the marketplace. And you are fooling yourself if you're pouring your energy into changing things that way. That's not to say that, again, you can't make a trusted relationship with a specific place, and that is a good thing. That's obviously true. But on the level of making decisions that when I'm going through a supermarket and picking items off the shelves, which I don't know anything about that, and I don't have a true one-to-one relationship with those consumers, that is not something I believe will drive change. And so I've kind of like deprioritized the energy that I used to put in to that discrimination between goods and put that towards like, how am I going to advocate for policy level things? How am I going to support unions? How am I going to, and if not unions because you think there's some bugaboo, like how am I going to support workers' rights to self-advocate for themselves, and how, wage floors and advocating for like, trade treaties with enforcement teeth and things like that. So my diet really hasn't changed. The asterisks and why I said like the official answer in the beginning is I don't eat that much Thai shrimp anymore because I interviewed a lot of people who were imprisoned on boats, and and it's unfair. You know, the Thai industry has reformed since I wrote. I wrote this stuff or I didn't write, but I was doing my research in 2015, 2016. There have been big changes there. They have suffered from the bad press, and they've reformed. I don't want to buy them because when I'm eating that shrimp now, I can think of the people who were abused getting it in the most horrible ways. But that's a good example of like where I'm making a discrimination in goods, and it's maybe not even a helpful one.
Yeah. You're part of a tradition in journalism that examines the food industry, you know, going back to the meatpacking plants in Chicago a long time ago. And, you know, I mentioned Food Inc. There's been others. And I think you're saying that there actually has been some effect of people pointing out things like the Thai shrimp industry and bringing that to a broader audience and people responding. Do you feel like there's positive change is possible from work like yours?
I mean, I hope so. Yeah. I'm an optimist. That's why I wrote the book. Fundamentally, I think positive change is going to happen. I think one of the important parts of that is like keeping the ways that we're changing things honest. And so the certification regime is like built on good intentions. I think good things have resulted from it. I don't ultimately think that it's going to be the conduit to creating a better world. And so, yeah, I want to hold both those ideas in the same time. I think, you know, in terms of food safety, like the time from Upton Sinclair to now, it's the time from Jack in the Box, you know, and Odwalla, 1990s to now, has been radical change for the better. Meat isn't being recalled in this country in the same way it was in the 90s. This is great news. I think we can do the same thing for labor. It's going to be more difficult because our entire economic system right now, it rests on taking cuts out of laborers, but I think it's possible.
So let's say you get a surprising email tomorrow and it says that you're going to be head of the USDA. What are some things that you would want to put in place?
God, I would start a hiring committee for someone more qualified, pretty much immediately. What would I do if I was the head of the USDA? I don't know. The big things that I can think about is creating an iron wall between lobbying and the people who are running the USDA, and making a moratorium on that. And I say that knowing that a lot of the smartest minds and also the people who are qualified to talk about our food system do come from industry. And so I think it's about severing the incentive and structure that you can then go from government back into the private sector, not stopping people from going from the private sector into government and taking those sympathies with them. But I do think that there is a problem with money in politics, and the USDA bears that out. And I would love to be part of solving that. Then I'll retire and hand it off to someone else.
Yeah. And who do you think is already out there in the political world that is moving things in the right direction? And what kind of issues do you see that are moving forward and progress being made?
I think we're in a tremendously exciting issue. We're in a tremendously exciting time. I think a lot of these issues are coming up from all over. I think it's no secret with how sympathetic I am to labor that I'm probably pretty far to the left on some of these issues. And so, AOC I see as like, a real political talent that I hope gets cultivated. And I think, just a lot of the discussion around undocumented workers has really been inspiring to me in terms of like bringing that lens into just how much as a country we depend on this workforce and how much we need to be honoring that fact that we're dependent on them by giving them dignified lives. And that I am not like of the opinion that is like, there's a one fix all, like open borders or whatever. There's not one targeted fix to that. There's a lot of ways to create that dignity. But I think it's being talked about in ways that it wasn't being talked about in the recent past.
Yeah, amazing. And For someone who's inspired by your work, and I think there's quite a few people, and they're thinking, okay, I'm interested in this. I want to discover things. How do you get started?
I don't know. I don't know how I got started. I always wanted to write. I was a public school teacher for a long time. I always thought I was going to write. So start young and know you're going to be a writer. I mean, writing is a cruel condition to put anyone in. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. It's not a particularly pleasurable way to spend your time. You're desk bound, hunched over. Yeah, or you're doing research is the best part, but the actual writing process is pretty miserable, even though that's obviously what sustains you. So I think having that drive and knowing that that's what you want to do is the only kind of get started piece. I mean, again, like I was an undergraduate biology major. I went into teaching in the public school systems as a science teacher because I thought that would be a way to pay the bills while I was a writer. But I have no like training as a writer per se, except for I love reading, and I believe that if you apply yourself to any problem with a kind of dogged tenacity, you're going to make it. You're going to make some progress there.
Amazing. Okay. And what are you working on next? Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah. In the very coyest, broadest terms, because it's in the beginning, and it's less about being coy actually, and more that I don't know what I'm talking about. But I'm looking in the green energy space and looking at the electrification of the grid, and I really would like it to be an upbeat book. After writing 2 books that were more dismal, the first book was like it was kind of a pre-Me Too book about an abusive yoga guru, and this book has lots of human darkness in it as well. So hopefully it will be a more upbeat look at that space.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, it's been really fascinating talking to you. I want to say thank you, Benjamin.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for tuning in to the Farm.One podcast. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can email us at info@Farm.One, or you can visit our website, Farm.One. We'd love to hear what you think and ideas about new guests, that kind of thing.